In World War I, the American government had to hire professional rat catchers for the trenches because soldiers were dying from rat-borne diseases faster than from German bullets. Some rats grew as big as cats after feasting on corpses and would even eat the faces off sleeping soldiers. So yeah, if these stories help you sleep, subscribe would be cool. Also drop where you're listening from and the time. I check the comments, and it's crazy seeing people from like Australia and Norway on the same video. Alright, tonight we're heading back to World War I. But hold on, get yourself comfortable first. I mean it. Fix your pillows, grab that blanket. This one's worth settling in for. You're waking up in 1914 America. The first thing you notice is how damn quiet it is. No planes overhead, no highway hum. Just birds and maybe a horse-drawn wagon on cobblestone streets if you're in the city. Your cotton nightshirt scratches against your skin as you roll over in bed. The smell of coal smoke drifts through the window. Almost everyone heats their home with coal or wood. America smells different 100 years ago. Grittier, rawer. The papers are filled with news of some royal guy who got shot in a place most Americans couldn't find on a map. Sarajevo, Serbia, Austria, Hungary. These were just foreign words to most folks living their lives in Boston or Chicago or San Francisco. Europe's problems seemed 1,000,000 miles away, separated by an ocean that still took about a week to cross on the fastest ships. "Thank God for President Wilson," your neighbour says over the fence as you collect your morning milk delivery. "At least he'll keep us out of Europe's mess." And it's true. When the war breaks out in Europe, Woodrow Wilson, imagine the most professor-looking dude you've ever seen, thin with round glasses and always dressed like he's heading to church, stands before Congress and tells Americans to be neutral in fact as well as in name. Think about this. Wilson was basically an accidental president. The Republicans had split their vote between Taft and Teddy Roosevelt, letting this Democrat academic slip into the White House. And now, here he was, facing the biggest global crisis in generations. "My friend's boy is thinking of joining the Canadian forces," a woman whispers in the market. "Says he can't just sit while democracy is threatened." Some Americans felt that pull, especially those with family ties to England or France. But most were perfectly happy staying out of it. America was building skyscrapers, cranking out Model T Fords, and enjoying baseball games. War was Europe's problem. You know what's crazy? At this exact moment, while America was chill as hell about the war, guys your age in France and Germany were already dying by the hundreds of thousands in places like the Marne and Ypres. Villages getting wiped off the map, entire generations of young men being erased, and America's just like, nah, we're good over here. But here's the thing about neutrality. It's complicated when money's involved. American banks and businesses were making an absolute killing selling stuff to Britain and France. Like hundreds of millions of dollars in weapons, food, raw materials, you name it. By 1915, if the Allies had lost, Wall Street would have collapsed from all the unpaid loans. So America was neutral, but with a fat asterisk next to it. "My cousin works at the docks," a guy tells you at the barbershop. "Says they're loading ships with shells day and night. Some neutrality, huh?" Germany, meanwhile, is watching all these American goods flow to their enemies and thinking, what the actual hell? They're trapped by the British naval blockade and starving while American factories are working overtime to help the Allies. So the Germans make a fateful decision: unrestricted submarine warfare. Their U-boats would sink any ship heading to Britain, warning or no warning. And that's where things start getting personal for Americans. Picture this: May 7th, 1915. the ocean off Ireland. The Lusitania, this massive, beautiful passenger liner, is cruising along. Nearly 1,200 passengers, including 128 Americans. No one's particularly worried despite German warnings in New York newspapers that the ship might be targeted. Then, without warning, boom! A single torpedo tears through the hull. The ship lists badly. People are screaming, clawing for lifeboats. Children separated from parents. Within 18 minutes, this floating palace is gone, dragged under the cold Atlantic. Almost 200 people dead. The newsboys are screaming the headlines on street corners the next day. Papers show babies who drowned, women lost. The photos are everywhere. They're animals. A man spits on the streetcar. What kind of people target civilians? Wilson sends a strongly worded note to Germany but doesn't declare war. Not yet. Germany backs down a bit on submarine attacks and things cool off temporarily. But anti-German sentiment is growing. You notice it everywhere. The German family that runs the bakery down the street. People are whispering they might be spies. German language classes, which were super common in schools, start getting cancelled. Sauerkraut gets renamed Liberty Cabbage, which, not gonna lie, sounds disgusting. They changed the name of our street yesterday, a kid tells you. Used to be Hamburg Avenue, now it's Wilson Avenue. My dad says it's stupid. Here's a messed up bit of trivia for you. Before the war, about 25% of American high school students studied German. By 1918, that number dropped to 1%. We just erased an entire language from our education system. And then on July 30th, 1916, things get even wilder. Black Tom Island, this massive munitions depot in New York Harbor, suddenly explodes in the middle of the night. The blast is so powerful it registers as a 5.0 earthquake, breaks windows across Manhattan, and damages the Statue of Liberty. Shrapnel rains down for miles. You wake up thinking it's the end of the world. The entire harbour is glowing orange, windows shattered for miles. German saboteurs, everyone says. And they're right. German agents had infiltrated and deliberately set off this massive explosion. American soil attacked directly. Still, Wilson doesn't declare war. He's running for re-election on the slogan, "He kept us out of war and it works." He narrowly wins a second term. But the Germans are getting desperate. By early 1917, they decide to double down on submarine warfare, figuring they can starve Britain into submission before America can meaningfully enter the war. American ships start getting sunk. American sailors start dying. The pressure builds. And then the final straw. The Zimmerman telegram. British intelligence intercepts a secret message from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmerman to Mexico, proposing an alliance. If Mexico joins Germany against the US, they'll get back Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico after the war. When this hits American newspapers in March 1917, people absolutely lose their minds. They want to give away American states, a woman gasps on the train platform. Our states? You can feel the mood shift everywhere. Even the peace activists are quieting down. This isn't just about Europe anymore. This is about American ships, American lives, American territory. Wilson calls Congress into session. On April 2nd, 1917, he stands before them looking grim as hell. The professor is gone. Now he's a wartime president. The world must be made safe for democracy, he tells them. 4 days later, on April 6th, Congress officially declares war on Germany, and just like that, after nearly 3 years of watching from the sidelines, America is heading into the most devastating conflict humanity had ever known. Factories switch to making weapons. Recruiting posters appear on every corner. Young men line up outside enlistment offices. My brother signed up yesterday, a girl tells you, her eyes both proud and terrified. Says he'll be in France by Christmas. America, the sleeping giant, had finally awakened. And nothing, not for the country, not for the world, not for the millions of Americans about to be swept up in the war machine, would ever be the same again. As you fall asleep that night in 1917, the newspaper on your bedside table carries the massive headline, "America enters World War." The comfortable isolation of the Atlantic Ocean suddenly feels a lot smaller. The war that seemed so distant for nearly 3 years is now America's war too. Unlike your warm, safe bed tonight, thousands of Americans would soon be sleeping in muddy trenches across the ocean, with rats scurrying over them and the constant thunder of artillery making real rest impossible. The America you fell asleep in would be fundamentally changed by the time it woke up again. America had talked big about entering the war. Problem was, we weren't exactly ready to back it up. When Congress declared war in April 1917, the US Army was basically a mall security force with about 127,000 soldiers. The Germans had millions. Our Navy was decent, but we had almost no aircraft, few machine guns, and 0 tanks. With war declared, the nation faced a massive problem. How do you build an army from scratch and get it across an ocean patrolled by German U-boats? Turns out, with a hell of a lot of organisation, money and American industrial might. The morning after the declaration of war, you wake to the sound of a brass band playing patriotic tunes down the main street. A recruiting station has popped up overnight. Just a table with an American flag and 2 serious-looking officers in uniform. A line of young men stretches around the block. "My mother cried all night," says the butcher's son as he waits in line, "but I told her better to fight them over there than wait for them to come here." The recruitment poster on the wall shows Uncle Sam pointing directly at you, those eyes following you everywhere. "I want you for US Army," it demands in bold letters. It's unnerving how effective it is. President Wilson and Congress knew volunteers wouldn't be enough. So on May 18, 1917, they passed the Selective Service Act, the draft. All men between 21 and 30 had to register. Nearly 10 million did on the first registration day alone. Your neighbourhood empties of young men almost overnight. They're calling it the American Expeditionary Force, your co-worker tells you as you read the paper over lunch. General Pershing's in charge. Blackjack, they call him. General John Blackjack Pershing was a tough, no-nonsense commander who'd chased Pancho Villa around Mexico. Now he had an even bigger job, to build, train, and lead an American army in the most destructive war in history. When Pershing arrived in France in June with just a small advance force, a French officer supposedly told him the Americans could now go home because they'd done their part. Pershing's aide, Colonel Charles E. Stanton, responded with what became a famous line, "Lafayette, we are here," referring to the French hero who'd helped America during the Revolutionary War. America was returning the favour, though the real help would take months to arrive. Meanwhile, across America, training camps sprouted like mushrooms after rain. Places like Camp Lee, Camp Dix, Camp Funston, 32 new camps in total, each a small city of wooden barracks built practically overnight, each one housing up to 40,000 soldiers. Imagine the scene. Thousands of civilians becoming soldiers, farm boys who'd never left their counties, city kids who'd never fired a gun, rich college boys training alongside poor immigrants who barely spoke English, all thrown together in massive barracks with no privacy, and minimal sanitation. "Jesus, this isn't what I expected," mutters the banker's son, as he gets his head shaved alongside 50 other naked recruits. "I thought we'd at least get our own rooms." The training was brutal and rushed. Most American soldiers got about 4 months of instruction before shipping out. They learned to march in formation, fire their Springfield rifles, fix bayonets, and dig trenches. They were taught rudimentary French phrases. "Où est l'ennemi?" Where is the enemy? "Je suis américain." I am American. But there were so many things they weren't prepared for. Gas warfare, trench foot, rats, lice, the psychological horror of endless artillery bombardment, the reality of seeing your friends blown to pieces. These were lessons they'd learned the hard way in France. Disease tore through the training camps. The close quarters, stress, and basic hygiene were perfect breeding grounds for everything from measles to meningitis, and that was before the Spanish flu hit. "Half my company's in the infirmary," a soldier writes home. "They say it's just a cold, but Davis from Tennessee died yesterday. His face was blue." But it wasn't just men training. American industry was mobilizing too. The government created new agencies overnight. The War Industries Board, the Food Administration, the Fuel Administration. Factories that had been making cars now made tanks and aircraft engines. Textile mills churned out uniforms instead of suits. Shipyards worked around the clock. The government needed money too, about $30 billion or nearly $570 billion in today's money. They sold Liberty bonds to ordinary Americans with aggressive ad campaigns, making it practically unpatriotic not to buy them. Mrs. Wilson down the street didn't buy any bonds. A woman whispers at church, "I wonder if her husband has German relatives." The hysteria about anything German reached fever pitch. People with German last names changed them overnight. Sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage. Hamburgers were renamed Liberty sandwiches. Beethoven was banned from concert halls. German books were burned in the streets. Teaching the German language became illegal in many states. "They arrested old Mr. Muller yesterday," your neighbour tells you over the fence. "Said he was making suspicious radio transmissions. It was just his ham radio hobby. He's lived here 30 years. Robert Prager, a German-born coal miner in Illinois, was actually lynched by a mob in April 1918 on suspicions of being a German spy. The men who killed him were acquitted, with the defense attorney asking the jury, "Would you convict American citizens for killing an enemy spy?" As America prepared for war at home, the first troops were already crossing the Atlantic. Getting hundreds of thousands of men safely to Europe was a logistical nightmare. German U-boats patrolled the shipping lanes, and a single torpedo could send a transport ship with thousands of soldiers to the bottom of the Atlantic. The army converted passenger liners into troop transports. The USS Leviathan, formerly the German luxury liner Vaterland, could carry 14,000 troops at once. But conditions on these ships were horrendous. Overcrowding, seasickness, disease. "Haven't seen the sun in 4 days," a soldier scribbles in his diary as his transport pitches in the North Atlantic. "Men vomiting everywhere. Bunks stacked 4 high. Can't even get to the latrines when the ship rolls. Pray for land soon." The troop ships travelled in convoys, protected by destroyers that zigzagged around them, dropping depth charges at any hint of a U-boat. Still, ships were lost. The SS Tuscania was torpedoed on February 5, 1918, with 210 American soldiers killed. For most American troops, the journey took about 2 weeks. They arrived in ports like Brest, Saint-Nazaire and Bordeaux, wide-eyed and exhausted, setting foot on foreign soil for the first time in their lives. "The French ladies threw flowers at us," a corporal from Kansas writes home. "Little children begged for chocolate. Everyone cheered like we were saviours. I don't know if we are." The first American troops got a hero's welcome, but they were still woefully unprepared for what awaited them. Many arrived without proper equipment. The Americans had to buy artillery from the French, using French tanks and aircraft. Even helmets, the distinctive doughboy helmet, were based on British designs. The British and French commanders, hardened by years of brutal warfare, wanted to use the fresh American troops as reinforcements, splitting them up among their own battle-weary divisions. But General Pershing absolutely refused. You hear what Pershing told the French general, a staff officer recounts over dinner, said the American flag will not be subordinated to any flag. Man's got steel in his spine. Pershing insisted on keeping the American Expeditionary Force together as a unified army under American command. He knew that politically, America needed its own victories, its own heroes, its own place at the peace table when the war ended. Throughout the fall and winter of 1917, American troops continued their training in France behind the lines. Their camps were a strange mix of military precision and muddy chaos. Barracks if they were lucky, tents if they weren't, endless drills, marches and bayonet practice. The French and British veterans tried to teach the Americans what they'd learned through years of bloody experience. How to detect gas attacks, how to properly clear a trench with grenades, how to endure the psychological torture of artillery bombardment without breaking. "The British sergeant who's training us has this 1,000-yard stare," a lieutenant writes to his wife. "Says he's the last man alive from his original company. Everyone else is dead. Tells us we're too loud, too confident. Says that'll change fast once we get to the front." As 1917 turned to 1918, the Americans were almost ready. They'd transformed from a token force to a real army of over 250,000 men in France, with thousands more arriving each week. The German High Command was watching with growing concern. If Germany couldn't win the war before the Americans fully deployed, they probably couldn't win at all. In March 1918, the Germans launched a massive offensive, their last desperate gamble to win before American power could be fully brought to bear. They attacked with everything they had, using new stormtrooper tactics. The British and French lines buckled under the assault, and there, in the path of the German onslaught, the first significant numbers of American troops were about to get their baptism by fire. After months of preparation, the doughboys were finally heading to the front lines. The Americans were no longer watching the war from across the Atlantic. They were in it with all the mud, blood and horror that entailed. And for many of these young men, so far from their peaceful American homes, the comfort of a real bed and a safe night's sleep was about to become a distant memory. Dawn in the trenches is nothing like dawn anywhere else on earth. You don't so much wake up as realize you've stopped hallucinating from exhaustion. Your eyes crack open to darkness. It's still an hour before sunrise, but everyone's already moving. Stand to, they call it. Every man at his post, rifle ready, eyes fixed on no man's land, the most dangerous time of day, when attacks usually come. The American trenches in early 1918 were a twisted maze of mud walls, wooden duckboards, and misery. Unlike your cozy bed right now, soldiers slept wherever they could, on narrow wooden platforms, in small dugouts carved into trench walls, or sometimes just sitting up, backs against the mud. Sleep was a luxury stolen in 20-minute increments between shell barrages and guard duty. Johnson fell asleep on watch last night, a sergeant whispers as he checks the line. Captain's sending him up for court-martial. Could be shot for that. The first thing that hits you, before you even see the trench, is the smell. A combination of unwashed bodies, human waste, rotting corpses in no man's land, cordite from shells, poison gas residue, and the omnipresent mud. It clings to your nostrils, soaks into your uniform, follows you into your dreams. Veterans said they could still smell it decades later. "My wife sent me cologne," laughs a corporal from Philadelphia. "Like that's gonna help. You could bathe in perfume and still smell like death warmed over after an hour here." Breakfast, if you're lucky, is coffee so weak it's practically water, some hard biscuits that could break teeth, and maybe canned meat that smells suspiciously like the trench itself. Food is prepared miles behind the lines and brought up in containers. By the time it reaches the front, it's usually cold, congealed, and unappetizing. What makes it worse is knowing that the officers eat better. They have their own cooks, their own mess. It's not gourmet, but it's a hell of a lot better than what the average doughboy gets. "Lieutenant Morris gained weight since we got here," mutters a private as he chokes down something resembling oatmeal. Meanwhile, I can count my own ribs. After breakfast comes the daily routine, cleaning rifles. The mud gets everywhere, and a jammed rifle means death in a raid or attack. Repairing damaged sections of trench, filling sandbags, endless sandbags. The trench needs constant maintenance as rain and shells destroy the walls. For the first few months of 1918, most American troops were placed in quiet sectors of the front, areas where major offensives weren't expected. They were paired with French or British units to learn the ropes. It was called trench apprenticeship, but that makes it sound safer than it was. Even quiet sectors saw regular sniper fire, artillery and trench raids. "We lost Michaels yesterday," a lieutenant notes in his diary. "Raised his head too high looking at a bird. Sniper got him right between the eyes. Just like that. We're in a quiet sector." Life in the trenches followed a bizarre routine. The front line was rarely occupied for more than 5 days at a time before troops rotated to support trenches, then reserve trenches, then a brief rest period behind the lines. But those 5 days at the front could feel like 5 years. The worst part wasn't the enemy, it was the environment. Trench foot was a constant danger. Standing in water and mud for days caused men's feet to swell, blister and rot. In severe cases, amputation was the only option. "Jenkins got evacuated yesterday," says the company medic. "Took off his boots and his feet were black. Literally black. Gangrene. He'll lose them both." Then there were the rats. Fat, fearless trench rats the size of cats. Gorged on corpses and garbage. They'd run over your face while you slept. Steal food from your pockets. Some soldiers told stories of wounded men, unable to move, being eaten alive by rats during the night. "Killed 15 rats in my dugout last night," a sergeant boasts. "The little bastards were having a party on my chest when I woke up." And of course, the lice. Millions of them, living in the seams of uniforms, causing constant itching and spreading trench fever. Soldiers called them cooties or seam squirrels. They'd spend hours chatting, crushing lice between their fingernails. "Only way to really get rid of them is to run a candle along the seams," explains a veteran to a fresh-faced replacement. "Burns the eggs. But watch you don't set yourself on fire." Blanchard in Company B did that last week. When soldiers rotated to the rear for their brief rest periods, the first thing that happened was delousing. Their clothes were steamed, their hair cut short, their bodies scrubbed. For a day or two, they'd be clean. then back to the front, and the cycle began again. Water was another constant struggle. Clean water was precious, delivered to the front in petrol cans. Men would go days without washing. Shaving was done with cold water and dull razors, leading to cuts that easily became infected in the filthy conditions. "Got a letter from my girl yesterday," a private says, showing a worn photograph. "Says she can't wait to see me. Imagine if she saw me now. Haven't bathed in 2 weeks, beard full of lice, smell like something that died." The Germans, for all their fearsome reputation, were facing the same miserable conditions just a few hundred yards away. Sometimes at night you could hear them singing or talking in their trenches. "Hey Fritz," an American would sometimes yell across no man's land. "Got any real coffee over there?" Sometimes the Germans would yell back in perfect English, "Come over and get some, Yank." These moments of humanity were brief. The reality was that both sides were trying to kill each other. Snipers worked day and night. Artillery fell randomly, turning men into red mist without warning. And always there was the fear of the next big push, going over the top into no man's land. For many American units, their first real taste of combat came at Seicheprey on April 20th, 1918. The 26th Yankee Division was holding what was supposed to be a quiet sector when German stormtroopers launched a massive raid. Over 3,000 Germans hit the American lines in the pre-dawn darkness. "They were on us before we knew what was happening," recalls a survivor. "Gas shells first, then these Germans in body armour with flamethrowers, like fighting demons from hell." The Americans fought desperately but were outnumbered and outflanked. By the time reinforcements arrived, the Germans had withdrawn, taking over 100 American prisoners. It was a harsh lesson in the realities of trench warfare. But the real test for the American forces came on May 28, 1918, at the Battle of Cantigny. This was different, not defending against a German attack, but launching their own offensive. The 1st Division, the famous Big Red one, was tasked with taking the village of Cantigny from entrenched German positions. The night before the attack, men tried to write letters home. Some prayed, others drank contraband liquor. Many just stared into space, already looking like the ghosts some would become by morning. "If I don't make it," a corporal from Georgia tells his buddy, "make sure my ma gets my watch. It was my pa's." At 6:45 a.m., after a massive artillery barrage, the Americans went over the top, climbing out of their trenches and advancing across no man's land toward the German positions. French tanks supported the attack, belching smoke and fire as they crushed barbed wire under their tracks. The noise was indescribable. Hundreds of artillery pieces firing at once, machine guns rattling, the screams of wounded men, officers blowing whistles and shouting commands that no one could hear. The Americans pushed forward through a storm of bullets and shells. They reached the village and engaged in brutal hand-to-hand combat, bayonets, trench clubs, even bare fists. By the end of the day, Cantigny was in American hands. The US had won its first significant battle on the Western Front. But victory came at a terrible cost, over 1,600 American casualties, and the horror wasn't over. For the next 2 days, the Germans counterattacked repeatedly, trying to retake the village. Artillery pounded the American positions constantly. "Haven't slept in 50 hours, an officer scrawls in his notebook. "Men fighting like zombies." Anderson got his arm blown off but kept firing his pistol with his left hand until he passed out from blood loss. "Don't know how much longer we can hold." But hold they did. The Battle of Cantigny was small in the grand scheme of the war, but it was enormously significant for American morale. It proved the doughboys could fight and win against the vaunted German army. Meanwhile, the larger German spring offensive continued. In late May, German forces punched a massive hole in Allied lines along the Chemin des Dames ridge and pushed toward Paris. By May 31st, they had reached the Marne River, just 37 miles from the French capital. The situation was desperate. The French were reeling. The British were stretched thin. Now it was time for more Americans to enter the fight, ready or not. Near the town of Château-Thierry, the US 3rd Division rushed to help block the German advance at the Marne River. They arrived just in time, with engineers helping to destroy bridges as German forces approached the opposite bank. "Never seen anything like it," a French officer reportedly said as American trucks packed with troops rolled endlessly toward the front. "They just keep coming." As May turned to June, an even more significant test awaited the American forces at a place called Belleau Wood. The Americans were learning the brutal realities of modern warfare at an accelerated pace. Their initial, sometimes naive enthusiasm was being tempered by blood and suffering. But they were still fresh, still determined, still convinced they could make a difference in this terrible war that had already claimed millions of lives. As you drift off tonight, safe in your comfortable bed, imagine those young men from a century ago trying to snatch moments of sleep in muddy holes, with rats running over them and shells exploding nearby. Think about how they persevered despite conditions we can barely imagine today. The worst was yet to come for the American Expeditionary Force, but they had proven one thing already. The Americans had arrived, and they could fight. By early June 1918, the German spring offensive was threatening Paris itself. French morale was dangerously low after 4 years of grinding warfare. The British army was exhausted, and right in the path of the German advance stood the Belleau Wood, a hunting preserve about 5 miles long and 1 mile wide, filled with trees, boulders, and machine gun nests. The US 2nd Division, including a brigade of Marines, was rushed to the area to plug the gap in the Allied lines. They passed streams of French soldiers retreating from the front. It was here that Marine Captain Lloyd Williams uttered the famous line that would become Marine Corps legend. As a French officer advised him to retreat, Williams reportedly replied, "Retreat. Hell, we just got here." Whether he actually said those exact words is debated by historians, but the spirit of the statement perfectly captured the fresh determination the Americans brought to the war-weary Allied forces. On June 6th, the Marines attacked across an open wheat field toward Belleau Wood. They advanced in neat lines, bayonets fixed as if on parade, directly into German machine guns. It was almost suicidal bravery. Jesus Christ, it was like something from another century, recalls a surviving lieutenant. Men falling everywhere, but they just kept walking forward, not running, walking like they were strolling through the park. The Marines suffered over 1,000 casualties that day, but they reached the wood. What followed was 3 weeks of brutal close-quarters combat, fighting tree to tree, rock to rock, sometimes with bayonets and knives when the fighting got too close for rifles. "Found Jenkins and a German this morning," a corporal writes in his diary. "Both dead. Jenkins had his bayonet in the German's chest. German had a knife in Jenkins' throat. Must have killed each other at the same moment." The battle seesawed back and forth. The Americans would take a section of the wood. The Germans would counterattack and retake it. Artillery pounded the forest, turning ancient trees into splinters. Gas shells left pockets of poison lingering in low areas. snipers picked off anyone careless enough to expose themselves. By June 26th, after 3 weeks of hellish combat, the Marines finally secured the entire wood. The American commander sent a famous one-sentence report: "Wood's now US Marine Corps entirely." The cost was staggering. The Marines suffered almost 10,000 casualties at Belleau Wood, but they had stopped the German advance, and in doing so created an enduring legacy. The French later renamed the area Bois de la Brigade de Marine, Wood of the Marine Brigade, in their honour. The Germans, who had dismissed the Americans as inexperienced amateurs, had a new respect for them after Belleau Wood. They called the Marines Teufelhunden, devil dogs, a nickname the Marine Corps proudly adopts to this day. "These Americans are different," a captured German officer supposedly told his interrogators. "They're crazy. They don't retreat. They keep coming even when it's hopeless." As the German offensive stalled, the Allies prepared to take the initiative. On July 15th, the Germans launched one last major attack in the Second Battle of the Marne. But this time, the Allies, including significant numbers of American troops, were ready for them. The US 3rd Division earned the nickname Rock of the Marne by holding firm against repeated German assaults. Other American units fought alongside French colonial troops to blunt the German attack. After the German offensive failed, the Allied Supreme Commander, Ferdinand Foch, ordered a massive counterattack. The American 1st and 2nd Divisions spearheaded the assault at Soissons on July 18th, advancing about 5 miles in just 2 days, a huge achievement by Western Front standards. "Nobody told us it was supposed to be impossible," jokes a bloodied sergeant as he helps a wounded comrade to an aid station. "So we just kept going." But alongside the growing battlefield success came a new invisible enemy, one that would ultimately kill more Americans than German bullets and shells combined. In the spring of 1918, a deadly strain of influenza began spreading through military camps. By fall, it had become a global pandemic. This Spanish flu was particularly lethal to healthy young adults, exactly the demographic filling the trenches. "Half the company's down with this flu," a medical officer reports. "High fever, blue skin, drowning in their own fluids. Never seen anything like it. Lost 15 men yesterday alone, and they're still coming in." In October 1918, at the height of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, over 16,000 American soldiers would die from influenza. Hospital ships returning to the US became floating morgues. Some men who survived the worst battles of the war would die in their bunks from this invisible killer. Yet despite the ravages of disease, the American war effort continued to grow. By summer's end, over 1.3 million American troops were in France. They were no longer being fed piecemeal into the line. Now entire American armies were taking the field. On September 12, 1918, the American First Army launched its first major independent operation, the reduction of the St. Mihiel salient, a bulge in the Allied lines that had existed since 1914. Over 550,000 American troops participated, supported by 110,000 French soldiers, with 500 aircraft and 3,000 guns. It was the largest American operation of the war to date. In thick fog, American troops advanced behind a creeping artillery barrage. They achieved complete surprise against the German defenders, who were already in the process of withdrawing to stronger positions. "We expected a hard fight," an American colonel recalls. "Instead, we found half-empty trenches and Germans with their hands up. Some were still eating breakfast when we arrived." Within just 4 days, the Americans eliminated the salient, capturing 16,000 prisoners and over 400 guns at a cost of only 7,000 casualties. It was a striking success and proved that American forces could plan and execute large-scale operations. But General Pershing had little time to celebrate this victory. Just 2 weeks later, on September 26th, the Americans launched their largest battle of the war, the Meuse-Argonne offensive. This operation was part of the final Allied push to end the war. While British and French forces attacked elsewhere along the front, the Americans would drive towards Sedan, aiming to cut a critical German supply rail line. The Meuse-Argonne region was rugged, heavily forested, and had been fortified by the Germans for 4 years. It featured multiple defensive lines with concrete bunkers, dense belts of barbed wire, interlocking fields of machine gun fire, and pre-registered artillery. "God help us," mutters a veteran sergeant as he looks through binoculars at the terrain they're supposed to attack. "That's not a battlefield, it's a fortress." At 5:30 a.m. on September 26th, after a 3-hour artillery bombardment, over 700,000 American troops began advancing on a 24-mile front. Initial progress was good, with units pushing forward several miles. But as they penetrated deeper, resistance stiffened. The American forces included many green troops who had never seen combat before. Traffic jams clogged the limited roads, making it difficult to bring up supplies and reinforcements. The heavily wooded terrain broke up formations and complicated command and control. "Complete chaos," a staff officer writes in his report. "Units mixed together, commanders unable to find their men, artillery firing short into our own troops. It's a miracle we advanced at all." By September 29th, the offensive had stalled in the face of determined German resistance. Pershing was forced to reorganize, pulling exhausted divisions out of the line and replacing them with fresh troops. It was during this phase of the battle that one of the most famous episodes of American participation in the war occurred, the exploits of Sergeant Alvin York. York was a deeply religious man from the mountains of Tennessee who had initially claimed conscientious objector status. After discussions with his commanders about biblical justifications for warfare, he had decided to serve as a combat soldier. On October 8, 1918, York's patrol was caught in a deadly German machine gun crossfire in the Argonne forest. The small American unit suffered heavy casualties, and York found himself in command of the 7 survivors, pinned down by at least 35 machine guns. "What happened next still doesn't seem real," one of the surviving soldiers later recalled. "York just stood up and started picking them off with his rifle, like he was shooting turkeys back home. 1 shot, 1 German. Never seen anything like it." Using the marksmanship skills he had developed hunting in the Tennessee mountains, York systematically eliminated the German gunners. When 6 German soldiers charged him with fixed bayonets, he drew his pistol and dropped all 6, shooting from back to front so the ones in front wouldn't know their comrades behind them were falling. Eventually, a German officer offered to surrender his entire command if York would stop shooting. When the dust settled, York and his 7 men had captured 132 German soldiers, including 4 officers, and had taken 35 machine guns. For his actions, York received the Medal of Honor and became America's greatest hero of the war. "Don't really see what all the fuss is about," York reportedly said when told of his medal. "Just did what needed doing." With fresh troops and better organization, the American offensive resumed on October 14th. Progress remained difficult, with fierce German resistance and atrocious weather conditions. Constant rain turned roads into mud pits. Trench foot and influenza ravaged the American ranks, yet slowly, inexorably, the American forces pushed forward. By early November, they had advanced about 22 miles and were approaching their objective of Sedan. The critical German supply railway was under artillery fire. The German army, after 4 years of war, was finally breaking. Their allies were surrendering one by one: Bulgaria in September, Turkey in October, Austria, Hungary in early November. Mutinies broke out in the German navy. Revolution threatened at home, with American forces threatening their supply lines, British and French armies advancing elsewhere along the front, and their alliance system collapsing. The German leadership sought an armistice. The fighting continued even as the negotiations proceeded. On the morning of November 11th, just hours before the armistice was to take effect, American units were still attacking, still taking casualties, still pushing forward. At 11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns finally fell silent. The Great War was over. The cost had been enormous. In just a year and a half of involvement, America had mobilized over 4 million men, sent half of them to France, suffered 116,000 deaths, about half from combat, half from disease, and 204,000 wounded. The final American soldier killed in combat was reportedly Private Henry Gunther of Baltimore, who died at 10:59 a.m. on November 11th, just 1 minute before the armistice took effect. His unit had been ordered to keep pressing the attack until 11 a.m., an order that cost Gunther his life. In the muddy trenches, exhausted men reacted to the news with stunned disbelief. There were few celebrations at first, just a strange, almost unsettling silence after years of constant artillery and machine gun fire. "It's over," a mud-covered sergeant tells his equally filthy men. "We made it." Some laughed, some cried. Many just sat in silence, thinking of friends who hadn't lived to see this day. The survivors began to dream of home, of real beds, hot baths, decent food, and families waiting across the ocean. But while the fighting had ended, the struggle to secure a lasting peace was just beginning. And there, America would face challenges perhaps even more complex than those it had confronted on the battlefield. When the guns fell silent at 11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918, the world exhaled a collective breath it had been holding for 4 long years. In Paris, people poured into the streets, embracing strangers and weeping with joy. In London, crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, singing "God Save the King." In New York, Wall Street was buried under tons of ticker tape as impromptu parades formed. But in the muddy trenches along the Western Front, the reaction was often more subdued. These men had seen too much death, too much suffering to celebrate wildly. For many, the overwhelming emotion was simple relief. They had survived when millions hadn't. "Peters just sat down in the mud and started crying," recalls a corporal from Ohio. "Big guy, never showed emotion before, just sat there sobbing like a baby. Nobody said anything, we all understood." The morning after the armistice, many soldiers described an eerie feeling. The constant background noise of artillery and machine gun fire, a sound so ever-present they had almost stopped noticing it, was gone. Birds could be heard singing. Men spoke in normal voices instead of shouts. The silence was almost unnerving after years of cacophony. "Woke up this morning and thought I'd gone deaf," writes a lieutenant in his diary. "Then realised it was just quiet. Actually quiet. First time in 14 months. For the Americans, most of whom had been in the war for less than a year, the end brought a simple question: when do we go home? But the answer wasn't so simple. The war might be over, but the occupation of Germany was just beginning. Someone had to stay and ensure the Germans honoured the armistice terms. Some American units were selected to march into Germany as occupation forces. The Third Army, renamed the Army of Occupation, crossed the German border on December 1st, 1918. They advanced to the Rhine River, which they reached on December 13th. "Never thought I'd be having Christmas dinner in Germany," a sergeant writes home. "The locals are polite enough, if a bit stiff. Can't blame them, I suppose. Their sons won't be coming home at all." While ordinary soldiers focused on occupation duties or waited for orders to ship home, the politicians and diplomats faced the monumental task of negotiating a peace treaty. President Wilson had already laid out his vision for the post-war world in his famous 14-point speech in January 1918. Wilson genuinely believed he could create a new world order based on open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, free trade, disarmament, fair colonial policies, and national self-determination. Most importantly, he envisioned a League of Nations that would prevent future wars through collective security. "The professor's going to fix the world with his fancy ideas," an aide to French Premier Georges Clemenceau reportedly remarked. "Has he ever actually met any Europeans?" On December 4th, 1918, Wilson departed for France aboard the USS George Washington. He was the first sitting US president to visit Europe. His arrival in Paris on December 14th was met with scenes of near-religious adoration. Millions lined the streets, showering his motorcade with flowers. Women wept openly. Children were held up to catch a glimpse of the man many Europeans saw as their saviour. "Wilson! Wilson!" the crowd chanted. "Vive Wilson! Vive l'Amérique!" The president was deeply moved, but also somewhat uncomfortable with the messianic expectations. He knew the difficult negotiations ahead would require compromise, and the adoring crowds expected nothing less than miracles. "They think I can wave a magic wand and make everything perfect," Wilson confided to his doctor. "I'm afraid they're in for a disappointment." The Paris Peace Conference officially opened on January 18, 1919, at the Quai d'Orsay. 27 nations were represented, but the real power lay with the Big Four: President Wilson of the United States, Prime Minister David Lloyd George of Great Britain, Premier Georges Clemenceau of France, and Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando of Italy. From the start, Wilson's idealistic vision clashed with the more pragmatic, some would say vindictive, aims of his European counterparts. Clemenceau, who had seen his country invaded by Germany twice in his lifetime, was determined to crush German power permanently. Lloyd George had promised his war-weary electorate that Germany would pay for everything. "I must work with two men," Clemenceau famously quipped. Lloyd George, who doesn't mean what he says, and Wilson, who doesn't understand what he says. The negotiations dragged on for months, becoming increasingly acrimonious. Wilson fought hard for his 14 points, but one by one he was forced to compromise. Free trade. The Europeans wanted economic restrictions on Germany. Freedom of the seas. Britain wouldn't hear of it. Open diplomacy. Many key decisions were made in closed-door sessions. "The president looks terrible," one American delegate observed in March. "Pale, exhausted, almost haunted. He's fighting everyone, including his own advisers, and it's taking a toll." Wilson did achieve some victories. The League of Nations, his most cherished project, was incorporated into the treaty. The principle of self-determination led to the creation of new nations like Poland, Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia from the ruins of old empires. Colonial territories were placed under League of Nations mandates rather than being directly annexed. But on the crucial question of Germany, Wilson largely lost to Clemenceau and Lloyd George. The final treaty placed sole blame for the war on Germany, the infamous War Guilt Clause, required massive reparation payments, severely limited Germany's military, and took away all its colonies and significant chunks of its European territory. "This isn't peace," the German delegation protested when finally shown the treaty terms. "It's a 20-year armistice." The Treaty of Versailles was formally signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand that had triggered the war. The ceremony took place in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, deliberately chosen because it was where Germany had proclaimed its empire after defeating France in 1871. The symbolism of humiliation was intentional. 2 German representatives looking pale and grim signed the massive document. They were followed by Wilson, Lloyd George, Clemenceau, Orlando, and delegates from other Allied nations. The Great War was officially over. "Well, it is finished," Wilson said to his wife that evening. "And, as no one is satisfied, it makes me hope we've made a just peace, but it is all in the lap of the gods." Wilson returned to America physically and emotionally exhausted. He faced his toughest battle yet, getting the US Senate to ratify the Treaty of Versailles and join the League of Nations. Opposition was led by Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, a Republican who personally despised Wilson. Lodge didn't oppose the League of Nations entirely, but insisted on reservations that would protect American sovereignty and require congressional approval for any League military actions. Wilson, stubborn to a fault, refused to accept any changes to his treaty. It was all or nothing. He decided to take his case directly to the American people, embarking on a grueling speaking tour across the country in September 1919. "The President is killing himself," his doctor warned the First Lady. "His blood pressure is dangerously high. He needs rest, not a campaign tour." The warnings proved prophetic. On October 2, 1919, after delivering a speech in Pueblo, Colorado, Wilson collapsed. He was rushed back to Washington where, on October 6th, he suffered a massive stroke that paralyzed his left side and partially blinded him. For the remaining 17 months of his presidency, Wilson was essentially an invalid. His wife, Edith, became his gatekeeper, deciding which matters were important enough to bring to his attention. Many historians consider this period to be the first time a woman effectively ran the US government. Mrs. Wilson practically is president now, a White House staff member confided to his diary. The president sees only what she permits, signs only what she approves. The stroke didn't kill him, but it killed his presidency. With Wilson incapacitated, the fight over the Treaty of Versailles reached its climax in the Senate. On November 19, 1919, the treaty was rejected, failing to achieve the necessary 2/3 majority, either with or without Lodge's reservations. Wilson, from his sick bed, had instructed Democratic senators to vote against the treaty with reservations, preferring defeat to compromise. The United States never ratified the Treaty of Versailles and never joined the League of Nations, the organization its own president had fought so hard to create. "This is the most tragic thing that has ever happened in our history," Wilson told his doctor when informed of the Senate vote. "Think of the tragedy of it. We have torn down the house of civilization, and we alone refuse to rebuild it." While politicians argued in Washington, American soldiers continued the long process of coming home. The massive demobilization was almost as challenging logistically as getting them to Europe had been. By the end of 1919, Only about 16,000 American troops remained in Europe as occupation forces, down from over 2 million at the war's end. Ships crowded with doughboys arrived daily at ports like New York and Boston. Some units received ticker tape parades, but many soldiers simply returned to their civilian lives with little fanfare. Unlike the Civil War or World War II, World War I produced few monuments or national days of remembrance in America at the time. Went to war, came home, got my old job back at the mill, a former sergeant from Massachusetts wrote years later. Nobody much wanted to talk about it, not even other veterans. It was like we all silently agreed to just move on. For many veterans, the war had changed them in ways civilian society couldn't understand. Nightmares, what we now call PTSD, were common. Men who had lived through artillery barrages would dive for cover at the sound of a car backfiring. Some never fully readjusted. Baker from Company C lives on the streets now, an officer writes to a fellow veteran in 1921. Wife says he wakes up screaming every night, thinks he's back in the Argonne, drinks to forget, can't hold a job. There must be thousands like him. Despite the trauma, most veterans did reintegrate into society. They got jobs, started families, built the America of the 1920s. But they carried their experiences with them, often silently. The term lost generation, coined by Gertrude Stein and popularized by Ernest Hemingway, captured the sense of dislocation and disillusionment many felt. And what of President Wilson, the man who had led America into war to make the world safe for democracy? His health never recovered from the stroke. After leaving office in March 1921, he lived quietly in a house on S Street in Washington, occasionally receiving visitors who were shocked at his diminished state. On February 3, 1924, Woodrow Wilson died at the age of 67. His last words were reportedly, "I am ready." He was buried in Washington National Cathedral, the only president to be interred in the nation's capital. Wilson's vision of international cooperation would have to wait for another world war and another generation of American leadership. The League of Nations, without American participation, proved too weak to prevent the rise of fascism and the march toward an even more destructive global conflict. As you lie there in your comfortable bed drifting towards sleep, think about those doughboys returning from the trenches of France a century ago. How strange it must have felt to sleep in a real bed after months or years of mud and danger. How precious the simple comfort of clean sheets and the knowledge that no shells would wake them in the night. For many of them, the true luxury wasn't material comfort, but the simple peace of knowing they had survived when so many hadn't. The war that was supposed to end all wars didn't, of course, but for a brief hopeful moment in 1918, it seemed like humanity might have learned its lesson. That the horror of industrial warfare was so great that surely nations would find better ways to resolve their differences. That hope, like so many dreams, faded with the morning light. But it never completely died. As America entered the 1920s, it seemed determined to forget the war as quickly as possible. The country turned inward, embracing what Warren G. Harding called a return to normalcy. Isolation became the watchword in foreign policy. The country that had briefly stepped onto the world stage now exited just as quickly. America's done its part, declares a newspaper editorial in 1920. Let Europe sort out its own problems from now on. For the average American, life moved on. The Roaring Twenties brought prosperity, jazz, speakeasies, and a sense that the horrors of war were firmly in the rearview mirror. But for the nearly 5 million Americans who had served, the memories weren't so easily dismissed. Physical wounds were the most visible legacy. Men missing limbs became a common sight on American streets. Facial wounds were particularly devastating. Medical techniques had advanced enough to save lives that would have been lost in previous wars, but not enough to fully repair shattered bodies. "Met Thompson from my old unit yesterday," writes a veteran in 1922. "Shell took half his face at St. Mihiel. Wears a tin mask painted to look like a face. Children scream when they see him. Says he only goes out at night now." The invisible wounds were perhaps even more widespread. What we now call post-traumatic stress disorder was then known as shell shock, or war neurosis. Many veterans suffered nightmares, anxiety, depression, and flashbacks. Treatment options were limited, and the prevailing attitude was often simply to get over it. "Wilson has night terrors," confides the wife of a former artillery officer to her sister. "Wakes up screaming, covered in sweat. Doctor says it's just nerves and prescribed whiskey before bed, as if that helps." Some veterans found that the only people who truly understood were other veterans. American Legion posts founded in 1919 became gathering places where former soldiers could share experiences with those who didn't need explanations. "Don't have to pretend with the Legion boys," a former corporal explains. "They know, don't have to say a word, they just know." The government did make some efforts to care for veterans. The US Veterans Bureau was established in 1921 to provide medical care and rehabilitation services. Vocational training was offered to help wounded veterans find new careers, but these programs were often underfunded and poorly administered. For many veterans, the final insult came in 1924. During the war, servicemen had been issued life insurance policies and promised a bonus to be paid in 1945. Facing economic hardship, veterans began lobbying Congress for early payment of this bonus. In 1924, Congress passed the World War Adjusted Compensation Act, which provided certificates that could still only be redeemed in 1945 rather than immediate cash. 20 years from now, a bitter veteran comments, half of us will be dead by then. They're hoping we'll all be dead. The frustration would boil over during the Great Depression, when thousands of desperate veterans and their families marched on Washington in 1932, establishing a shanty town and demanding immediate payment of their bonuses. President Hoover responded by sending in troops under General Douglas MacArthur, who drove the bonus army out with tanks, cavalry, and tear gas, American soldiers attacking American veterans. "Never thought I'd see the day," a former sergeant who witnessed the scene recalls. "Doughboys who stood against the Kaiser's best running from their own army made me sick to my stomach." The bonus army incident contributed to Hoover's defeat in the 1932 election. Franklin Roosevelt still didn't pay the bonus early, but he did establish the Civilian Conservation Corps and other programs that provided jobs for many veterans. Finally, in 1936, Congress overrode Roosevelt's veto and paid the bonuses 9 years ahead of schedule. Beyond the veterans themselves, the war's impact on American society was profound but complex. For German Americans, the war had been particularly traumatic. Anti-German hysteria during the conflict had led to the suppression of their language and culture. German books were burned, German music banned, German foods renamed. Many German Americans anglicized their names to avoid persecution. My grandfather changed our family name from Schmidt to Smith in 1917, a woman shares decades later. Stopped speaking German even at home, made us all pretend we were English, a whole piece of our heritage gone just like that. The war also accelerated social changes already underway. Women, who had taken on new roles in factories and offices while men were fighting, gained the right to vote in 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment. Many historians see this as partly a recognition of women's contributions to the war effort. "My mother never worked outside our home until 1917, recalls a man born in the early 1900s. Then suddenly she was operating a crane at a munitions factory. Said it changed how she saw herself forever. Never again thought there was anything she couldn't do if she put her mind to it." For African Americans, the war had presented both opportunity and disappointment. About 380,000 black Americans served in the segregated US military, many in labor battalions, but some in combat units like the famous 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters, who spent more time in frontline trenches than any other American unit. "The French treated us better than our own army," a veteran of the 369th later recounted. "Gave us their helmets, their weapons, their respect. French general pinned medals on us while white American officers wouldn't even salute us." Many black veterans returned home hoping their service would lead to greater equality and opportunity. Instead, they faced the same discrimination as before, or worse. The summer of 1919 saw deadly race riots in dozens of American cities as black veterans, unwilling to accept second-class citizenship after fighting for democracy, clashed with whites determined to maintain racial hierarchies. "Wore my uniform to a job interview," a black veteran from Chicago wrote. "White manager said, 'That might have meant something in France, boy, but it don't mean a damn thing here. Never felt so small in my life.'" In foreign policy, America's retreat from international engagement was swift and decisive. The Senate's rejection of the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations set the tone. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, the United States largely avoided European entanglements, focusing instead on economic expansion in Latin America and the Pacific. "The war to end all wars has ended nothing," wrote journalist Walter Lippmann in 1922. "The peace to end all peace has settled nothing, and America has taken its ball and gone home." This isolationist stance would have profound consequences as new threats emerged in Europe and Asia. Without American participation, the League of Nations proved too weak to check Japanese aggression in Manchuria or Italian invasion of Ethiopia. The harsh terms imposed on Germany by the Treaty of Versailles, combined with the Great Depression, created conditions for the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party. "You mark my words," a prescient French marshal supposedly told an American counterpart in 1919, "the next war will start in 20 years, and you Americans will be back." He was almost exactly right. 20 years and 2 months after the Treaty of Versailles was signed, Germany invaded Poland, triggering World War II. By December 1941, America was once again sending its young men across the Atlantic and Pacific to fight. Many of the officers who led American forces in World War II had gotten their first combat experience in the trenches of World War I. General George Patton had commanded tanks in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. General George Marshall had been a staff officer in the First Army. A young officer named Dwight Eisenhower had trained troops, though he never made it overseas. "We learned hard lessons in 1918 that saved lives in 1944, General Marshall later observed. "The First World War was our bloody apprenticeship." The physical legacy of America's involvement in World War I can still be seen today. American cemeteries in France hold the remains of over 30,000 doughboys who never came home. The largest, the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery, contains 46 graves, most marked with simple white crosses or stars of David. the names of another 954 missing soldiers whose bodies were never found are inscribed on the walls of its chapel. For decades, World War I lived in the shadow of the larger, more morally clear-cut Second World War. The doughboys never received the public recognition accorded to the greatest generation, who fought Hitler and Imperial Japan. But in recent years, historians have given renewed attention to America's role in the First World War and its lasting significance. World War I transformed America from a regional power to a global one, explains a modern historian. It was our first step onto the world stage, a dress rehearsal for the superpower role we'd fully assume after World War II. The last American veteran of World War I, Frank Buckles, died in 2011 at the age of 110. With his passing, the war slipped entirely from living memory into history, yet its echoes continue to resonate. In the Middle East, where boundaries drawn after the Ottoman Empire's collapse still shape conflicts. In Europe, where the European Union represents in part a response to the nationalist rivalries that sparked 2 world wars, and in America's ongoing debate about its proper role in world affairs. As you drift towards sleep in your comfortable, peaceful bed, so different from the mud and misery of the trenches, consider how the brief American involvement in World War I helped shape the century that followed. The 116 Americans who died in the conflict, half in combat, half from disease, didn't end all wars as Wilson had hoped, but they did help preserve the democratic ideals that would eventually triumph in a longer struggle that extended beyond their lifetimes. Their war lasted just a year and a half for Americans, a brief but transformative moment in the nation's history, a time when the United States first assumed the role of global power that it continues to hold today. A time when ordinary Americans were called upon to make extraordinary sacrifices for causes larger than themselves. The doughboys are gone now, their voices silenced by time. But in letters, diaries, photographs, and memories passed down through families, they still have something to tell us. About courage in the face of industrial warfare's mechanized slaughter, about maintaining humanity amidst inhumane conditions, about the complex legacy of a conflict that reshaped nations, boundaries, and the international order. And perhaps most importantly, they remind us of the terrible cost of war, a lesson that must be relearned by each generation. As you close your eyes and surrender to sleep, far more comfortably than any soldier in the trenches of France ever could, remember that the peace we often take for granted was purchased at a steep price, and that the world we wake up to each morning was in part shaped by those young Americans who ventured over there more than a century ago. Sleep well, dream of peace,